can honestly be said it is an acute moment of self-defense. Iran is too close to a nuclear weapon. The stuff that was in Fõrdow is too advanced and too dangerous to leave laying around. Even now, it could be used to develop a dirty bomb, perhaps even a crude nuclear device with only 60% enrichment rather than 90% enrichment. It can be done. It's an inefficient bomb. It's not the way these bombs are usually made, but it can be done technically. You know, this is an acute threat to the United States, to the United States forces in the region, to United States interests, to United States allies. And ultimately, given how much Iran is aligned with Venezuela and Colombia and the drug lords and the open border in the South that we've been plagued with, it is a danger even to the continental United States, because you can't guarantee that such a thing can't be brought into the US. And the other thing is, Iran has developed missiles that have quite long range. It is developing missiles with 4,000 mile range, which means London is under threat from a nuclear device if they managed to cobble it together, and they were weeks away, if not days away. And then finally, they were trying to develop intercontinental missiles as well, and they're allied with North Korea that does have intercontinental missiles. So they're on every level, Iran's target was America. It was the heart of the West. It was the great Satan, because it's the center of power of what they hate. So there was no way Iran's threat would not wind up in New York, Washington, LA, or anywhere else in America unless we preempted it or prevented it. And that's what ultimately this strike was. It's a preventive strike by President Trump. It isn't a declaration of war. It isn't a long-term war with Iran. It is a specific move to prevent Iran's getting a nuclear weapon and potentially threatening our allies, the West, and even continental United States.
You're listening to East to West. I'm Sarah Martinez reporting from Jerusalem, and today is a historic day, 1 decades in the making. Since 1979, the Islamic regime in Iran has threatened the United States and vowed to destroy Israel. It armed proxies, funded terror, and pursued nuclear weapons with defiance. But now, after decades of threats from the Islamic regime, the United States has officially joined Israel's war against Iran. In a stunning escalation, U.S. B-2 bombers struck 3 Iranian nuclear sites, including the Fõrdow enrichment facility buried deep underground. No warning, no congressional approval, just decisive action. Now, President Trump vowed total victory, but his path there has stunned even his closest allies. What changed and what happens now? Well, joining us is Dr. David Wurmser, former Middle East advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney and a leading voice on U.S. strategy in the region. We'll break down the intelligence, the risks, and the future of Iran, its regime, and its so-called axis of power, axis of resistance. David, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's great being with you, Sarah.
I want to get your immediate reaction and the significance of just how big this moment is for not just the region, but the entire world.
You know, until now, I had been more on the side of those who wished that Israel would finish this job on its own, because in part, I wanted the strategic definition of this war to be more what the Israelis wanted than what President Trump wanted, because he wanted essentially a deal to remove the nuclear program, but not much else. And there's so much else with Iran that's the problem. And that really cuts to the heart of the answer, which is, you mentioned it started in 1979. People my age lived in the shadow of this evil for 46 years. There are thousands of dead Americans because of this regime. They have been at war with the United States since the beginning. They've been global terrorist supporters that have plagued the West. They've been allies of our enemies. Just in short, Iran has been a plague under this Ayatollah regime for 46 years. And every American I'm talking to who lived through that period and remembers also the hostage taking of the Iranians of the embassy, which is the beginning of the strategy of taking hostages over long periods of time, rather than the short-term sort of extortion hostage taking you had from the PLO of taking a hostage and threatening to kill him in a few hours. This was the long-term holding of hostages for major strategic gain. This was an Iranian invention that flowed from the very beginning of the revolution when they took our embassy hostage. To make a long story short, this regime has been the plague of the United States and the world on so many levels for 46 years that now marks finally the time where the West has overcome its fear of dealing with this regime, starting with the very brave act by Netanyahu in September last year, followed through with an even more brave act by Prime Minister Netanyahu now, to take on Iran directly and expose it as yes, it's an extremely dangerous country, a country that will be a lot more dangerous if it had nuclear weapons. But most importantly, it has limited options now to respond. So now is the last moment in which it can be dealt with. And now the Americans have joined in, and we see this is a problem we can handle now.
Walk us through, we'll get into the reactions of the Iranians and how we expect them to react later on. But I want to first help us understand Trump's strategy here, because there was so much mixed messaging leading up to this very moment. You know, at first there was these nuclear negotiations, him saying, you know, we want peace, we don't want to get involved in the Middle East, then saying total victory. Then he said he'd make a decision within 2 weeks. Then there was a potential chance for a ceasefire, and all of a sudden, U.S. B-2 bombers are bombing Fõrdow in Iran. What went through his head?
Yeah. Well, one thing that went through his head is what divides him from many MAGA supporters, which is most MAGA supporters are very young, and they don't remember the hostage crisis. They don't remember 1979. They don't remember the death to America that this regime said. Many of them don't even remember the thousands of Americans killed in Iraq, the hundreds of Americans that were killed in the Marine barracks, the hundreds of Americans that were killed in other terrorist acts. So Trump remembers. Trump knows what this regime is about. It has haunted him, and it's exposed something very important. Trump is not an isolationist. He does not want endless wars. Coming out of the Vietnam era, he understood there are stupid wars in his mind, and there are immoral wars. America did not fight an immoral war in Vietnam. It was a stupid war, either because our government didn't want to win, or because it was the wrong place to fight the war, or whatever. But at any rate, he did not see a moral reason not to fight. He was not against war per se. He was against this an unintelligent, in his word, unintelligent or dumb, which is really his word, or a misapplication of our power that just gets us bogged down in these grandiose schemes that America really doesn't want to engage in. So because Iran potentially could involve such things, he was very hesitant. But he was not fundamentally opposed to striking Iran. He was fundamentally opposed to striking Iran without trying to do it without a war, but he was always willing to not only as leverage the threat of war, but actually to go to war if indeed Iran did not solve this problem diplomatically. And as time went on and he began to pay more attention to this issue, Israel, I think, through intelligence and just spending time with President Trump, I think he began to understand not only the evil of the regime that he implicitly understood from the 1970s and 80s, but he began to understand that we're at the precipice of something exceedingly dangerous, and that now was the time to act. And now Iran had to give up its nuclear program, which was what the precipice was. And if they can't do it with diplomacy, he had to do it otherwise. And if you look at what he was doing all along the last few weeks, it seems like he was zigging and zagging and zigging and zagging. But what he really was doing was trying to give every last shred of chance to the Ayatollahs, even beyond the last chance, the second last chance, the third last chance, fourth last chance, to come around and give up their nuclear program. And when they didn't, he had no choice. And the Israelis struck. And now, he had a very simple question. Does he let Israel do it all the way, or does he act? And I think his calculation was twofold. One was Israel's already done much of the heavy lifting. The risk to American pilots and American in sort of being bogged down is very low. But there are certain technical things America can do that Israel cannot, which is to drop a GBU 57, one of those great big bombs, those 30,000-pound bombs
Down
that are
several
deep earth
meters below ground.
penetrators.
Right.
Exactly. So Israel can't do that. Now, Israel could have sent commandos. It could have taken lighter bombs and done it over a week, just penetrating over a week. But this is a once and done. You destroy the facility. And I think he began to think at that point, you know what? Israel's already carried us all the way up close to the finish line. So why don't we just do the thing we can do well, join them, because this is a worthy cause. Israel's been fighting the war for the world on this. So maybe the world, including myself, President Trump, we owe it to them to finish this and to do it to help them finish this job. Now, there's still a slight difference I see between the United States and Israel. The United States, I think, wants this nuclear program eradicated and surrendered entirely by the regime, but it does not want to go after the regime visibly. I mean, if it begins to topple, maybe, but it doesn't want to engage in real activities against the regime. And so far, it hasn't mentioned all that much about the missiles and so forth. Israel, of course, not only the nuclear, but the missiles, the terrorism, the ring of fire, just the fact that
Wanting to go after the head of the snake.
right,
Not
the
just
octopus and the head of the octopus has to be taken down. And while Israel can't tell the Iranian people what to do, and it's the Iranian people who have the power and now opportunity to take out their own regime and take their country back, Israel can give them the opportunity to do that. And I think Israel understood that while it's focused on these practical objectives of protecting itself with missiles and against missiles and against the nuclear, along the way things happen that destabilize the regime, and so the Israelis are not in a formal regime change strategy, but it is both a semi-expected and desirable outcome if it is, and that's slightly different. And now the Israelis don't really want to wait. Don't want to really stop until this regime is gone in some ways, because that really solves the problem and opens up an entirely new strategic environment. Whereas the United States, I think, is willing to stop at some point and keep the problem contained to very, very strict little box, or even a tiny little thimble box or something, but still contained rather than solved. So there's still a difference. But I think Israel's gone so far and will continue to go that in the end, the difference won't matter that much.
Trump is facing many reactions for launching these strikes, cheering support to instant condemnation from American lawmakers. Also mixed reactions from within his own camp. I mean, some backing the president's decision to attack Iran, and other voices opposed to U.S. foreign involvement of any sorts in the Middle East, saying, this goes against his campaign of America first. Now, I'm curious to hear what your take on that is. And is Iran a direct danger to the United States? I mean, could the U.S. really have avoided not getting involved militarily against the regime?
No, I think this has been 46 years in the coming. I think the United States has waited too long already to engage with Iran. It should have done it long ago. At the end of the day, the problem with them, let's start with the right, the allies of the MAGA movement, which is, to be honest, the MAGA movement is President Trump. There is no MAGA beyond President Trump.
Right.
The followers of President Trump. So it's kind of interesting to see these guys out there saying we're the true MAGA, not what Trump's done and what Trump's doing, because they're not. That's not MAGA. They'd be nobody if Trump didn't win the election. Now they're different because they're really true isolationists, or actually, there's two types. There are those who just don't like Israel. They didn't want to deal with Iran. They just have a different view of the Middle East, and they're using the excuse of isolationism to essentially pursue a fundamentally different policy that sees Israel and Iran. Iran may be with, especially if we encourage moderates, they can be our ally. Israel's a problem. They're not really going. So they're using it. But the isolationists are interesting because they're arguing that America can be safe and America first means to withdraw. Now, first of all, you can't say MAGA then. MAGAs make America great again. If you withdraw from the world, you have withdrawn from the world. That is not a great power. You have chosen not to be a great power.
But also, isn't that sticking your head in the sand?
Well, that is the long term.
Possible upcoming
That is
games?
absolutely the long-term result of it. The second thing is you're not a player, so you have no influence over what goes on in places. If you're not willing to engage in the Middle East, you have no voice in the Middle East. So America then just has to let the world go. If you're truly isolationist, the world just goes its way. And we have seen again and again in history that if you do that, you can, like you said, an ostrich, you can stick your head in the sand. Sooner or later, either the Nazis and the Japanese or the communists under the Soviets or Iran will eventually come to you. There is no fortress America. There's never been a fortress America, and there has never been a concept of fortress America in American political thought. We forget the first two wars America fought after the War of the Revolutionary War. Fought that from 1775 to 1781. The second war in 1785 to 1795 was the Algerian War in Algeria. The third war was the Barbary Coast War, which is in today's Libya, Tunisia. The two first wars we fought were in the Middle East. That's not Fortress America. That's America thinking globally as a mercantile power. And that's what the soul of America is. So this is not the traditional American view, this isolationist view. It's also not a safe view because America first will wind up America besieged. And that's not really a helpful nor a real good policy. So I think President Trump understands all that. He's not an isolationist. This is causing tensions with the rank and file of many in the MAGA movement. But they have to understand there is no MAGA without President Trump.
Trump didn't consult with Congress before attacking Iran. Walk us through the consequences of that decision.
Well, the War Powers Act obviously is something that some congressmen who didn't want this to happen will evoke to say you can't go to war without getting congressional approval. But this is exactly like the Barbary Coast Wars and the Algerian War and so forth. There's a specific issue that we had to deal with without an expectation of fighting a big war. Israel is fighting the big war. The United States did a very particular technical act in the framework of a larger Western response. And Israel's response, even though it's alone and it doesn't have anybody else with it other than now the United States, it is a response on behalf of the entire West. The Western response required the United States to do one fairly technical thing that it can only it can do. That is not entering a large war that we will get bogged down in or have to fight to its conclusion. It is a specific action. The second thing is it can honestly be said it is an acute moment of self-defense. Iran is too close to a nuclear weapon. The stuff that was in Fõrdow is too advanced and too dangerous to leave laying around. Even now, it could be used to develop a dirty bomb, perhaps even a crude nuclear device with only 60% enrichment rather than 90% enrichment. It can be done. It's an inefficient bomb. It's not the way these bombs are usually made, but it can be done technically. You know, this is an acute threat to the United States forces in the region, to United States interests, to United States allies. And ultimately, given how much Iran is aligned with Venezuela and Colombia and the drug lords and the open border in the South that we've been plagued with, it is a danger even to the continental United States because you can't guarantee that such a thing can't be brought into the U.S. And the other thing is Iran has developed missiles that have quite long range. It is developing missiles with 4,000 mile range, which means London is under threat from a nuclear device. if they managed to cobble it together, and they were weeks away, if not days away. And then finally, they were trying to develop intercontinental missiles as well, and they're allied with North Korea that does have intercontinental missiles. So they're on every level, Iran's target was America. It was the heart of the West. It was the great Satan because it's the center of power of what they hate. So there was no way Iran's threat would not wind up in New York, Washington, LA, or anywhere else in America unless we preempted it or prevented it. And that's what ultimately this strike was. It's a preventive strike by President Trump. It isn't a declaration of war. It isn't a long-term war with Iran. It is a specific move to prevent Iran's getting a nuclear weapon and potentially threatening our allies, the West, and even continental United States.
So what do you think the Iranians will do now? I mean, walk us through the retaliation strategy. Are we expecting them to ramp up their attacks against Israel? Will they fold? Are we facing, as you said, an imminent potential attack against the US? I mean, how far are they willing to go?
Well, the Iranian regime is not monolithic, but it is dominated by a certain crowd. And I believe Khamenei is in this crowd. These are true believers. And for a true believer, they hark back to what Muhammad did in the Battle of the Trenches, when it looked like all odds were against these early Muslims in Medina. And a lot of his followers began to get restless and say, what are you thinking? I mean, we're going to be obliterated. What? Why? Why are you doing this? And he basically said, this is a test. This is a test of our faith. As the battle got worse, it became a greater test of the faith because only the most true believers will go all the way and never give up on Allah. Never give up on Allah, no matter how bad it gets, even vast, ultimate, complete destruction. This is the way these guys think in Tehran, that every setback, even catastrophic setbacks like they're facing literally every couple of hours at the hands of the Israeli Air Force, is yet a deeper test of true faith, and makes them dig in even further into the belief that they have to stay the course, because only at the very end will the army of Muhammad and the true believers come to their assistance in the great battle between the forces of Hajjaj and so forth. So this is now true believers retreating into the belief that this is a test of their true faith, and they cannot give up. So that is who I think you're dealing with in Khamenei. That's who you're dealing with in Saeed Jalili, who's a big thinker on the security side in that regime, I think with most of the IRGC leadership. This is no longer the Khomeini crowd. The Khomeini crowd was this older school, which, as shocking as it is, it was called the rational school that goes back all the way to the medieval period. But their feeling was that the preservation of the Islamic revolution was the preeminent way of expressing faith. And as a result, if it threatened the very existence of the revolutionary regime, you have to make a deal. So they made a deal with Iraq in 1987, 88, and they signed the ceasefire. But if we remember, people at that period who now are very prominent, like Saeed Jalili, like Kalibaf, like Larijani, these people were furious, saying you didn't have enough faith in God. And that this was an expression of your lack of faith. So while those people may still be out there, they don't have the power. So unfortunately, I think Iran's going to go all the way. Will they maybe cut a momentary tactical deal with the United States, and Israel may face a Yemen type situation where America sort of calls the war off with itself, and Iran keeps going with a war of attrition against Israel, a few missiles every couple hours, sort of what we faced the last few days before this morning, which is a more serious attack. And then Israel has to make a decision, and fairly fast. Does it want to engage in a war of attrition like this? And obviously it can't. It's airspace, its economy. So Israel will have to dramatically escalate to bring this to a close, which ultimately forces Israel into a greater regime destruction. I don't want to say regime change, because the only ones who can change the regime are the Iranian people, but a regime destruction strategy, Or alternatively, maybe the Iranians will think this, we have to express our faith all the way and amass everything they have and go for one huge period of 2 or 3 days of unleashing everything they could conceivably unleash without caring what happens 3 days. Right now they have to have economy of use. They need to, whatever they do, they need to leave for a week from now, 2 weeks from now. So if they engage in a war of attrition with Israel, they're going to need to have missiles to do so. But if they choose that this is the final showdown, if they believe this is it, this is the final moment of truth, then, they'll write off the future and they'll unleash everything they've got. And they probably have enough to make that painful for the next 3 days, but only the next 3 days. So I think those are some of the scenarios we might see.
Well, meanwhile, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is hiding out in an underground bunker somewhere in Iran. He's named 3 successors in case he is assassinated by the Israelis, probably, or perhaps the Americans. We never know. What does this war mean for the future of the Islamic regime in terms of the so-called axis of resistance? And when we're looking at the geopolitical map of the alliances here in the Middle East, I'm talking about specifically, the Gulf countries. How do they view that? Are we going to continue seeing these proxies, or is this the first step towards the dismantling of Iran's proxies throughout the region?
This is now, the next 2 to 3 days will be the key. And this is where I'm a little bit concerned with where the United States is. If this regime survives, if there's a ceasefire that America decides we've done away with the nuclear program, Iran's willing to give up enrichment for the moment, says it gives up enrichment, we can come to a deal. And if we have a deal, first of all, you tell the Iranian people they've been sold out once again. So the option of a revolution pretty much goes away instantly under that circumstance. Then you've got a regime which will take the attitude of, okay, we can wait this out 3 years. We can quietly begin to rebuild what we can get away with. And in 3 years, President Trump will be gone. People won't pay attention. The Israelis will have done what they did and they can't restart it with ease. Again, it would be a major issue. And they can survive, and they can then maybe make the slow comeback, and maybe more rapidly after 3 years. The problem is the Iranians are not alone in thinking that. You would have the proxies think that. You would have the Saudis, the UAE, and American allies think that, and everybody would begin to calibrate and hedge. So the strategic moment of rewriting the Middle East, the wounded cobra, leaving the wounded cobra sitting in the side of the room to survive. He's still a cobra, and you're not able to turn your back on him. And if other cobras get into the room, you're torn between dealing with them. And you already see Egypt is unstable. Turkey is a big ideological problem and restless. I'm not saying they're going to be enemies, but Israel will not face, the United States and its interests and its allies will never face true quiet in the region in the foreseeable future. So you shut down threats that you can shut down. And the problem is, if you don't finish the job all the way with Iran and you sign a deal where the regime survives, you've essentially teed yourself up for having to deal with many threats at once that become almost impossible to navigate. And yet then you have to make real deals with the devil. Do we tolerate the Muslim Brotherhood, the Qatar and Turkey are peddling, or do we have a pro-Russian or Chinese government in Egypt that now rises? Or do we deal with an Iran resurgent beginning to once again threaten? It's a mess. On the other hand, if you go all the way, you get strategic clarity. Iran will not be a threat, even if there's chaos, and I don't believe there'll be chaos in Iran. But even if there's chaos, it is not a regional threat anymore. I personally believe that Iran will get its act together, and therefore you'll see them drift toward India and slowly drift toward an Israeli-Indian alliance, and you've fundamentally rewritten the strategic realities of the region in a way that makes all these other potential threats emerging as negligible and easily dealt with. So I really see that we're at the cusp in the next 3 days. Are we going to set ourselves up for a strategic nightmare in 10 years with Iran surviving, a nightmare for everybody, not only we, the United States, but also you, Israel. Um, or are we going to really strategically rewrite the Middle East's shape through the will and power and desire of the Iranian people to take back their country? And it's such a fundamentally different way that we're looking at 20, 30 years of perhaps war here and there, but very much reduced regional existential threats to our core allies and ourselves.
David, when we're talking about that Iranian retaliation against the United States, we spoke about exterior threats from Iran, but we didn't speak about the interior threats within the United States itself. And I'm talking about the pro-Palestinian movements that Khamenei has used to rally support by hijacking essentially the Palestinian cause in order to rally support in the West. We've seen over the past week, protesters holding banners with Khamenei's picture on it saying, hands off of Khamenei, hands off of Iran. What is the danger here of Iran using that influence in order to create a bigger threat from within against
it? It is extreme and proven. I mean, this is an excellent question, Sarah. What it is, look, you had after October 7th, last year when the war started with, and by the way, this Iran war really started on October 7th. That was a direct Iranian attack on Israel through its proxies, but it was direct. They were involved in everything. Truth is, Iran's been attacking Israel and America for, as we said, 46 years. But the acute phase of this war began on October 7th. And what happened in the United States immediately after? We see squads that are being organized to go to kill our presidential candidate, President Trump, by Iran. That their government admitted that they were organizing and planning to kill the president. They also put out videos fantasizing about the murder of President Trump. We capture squads that were out there trying to kill former Secretary of State Pompeo and former National Security Advisor John Bolton. So first of all, right off, a campaign of assassination by the Iranians against our leadership. The second thing that you saw was it's no accident. If you listen to very carefully to the statements of Khamenei in the week after, the day before you started seeing the campus protests explode in the United States, there was a statement put out by Khamenei saying, now you know what to do. Now is your moment, you people in the West. And then the next day, the riots or the pro-Palestinian demonstrations break out everywhere, and it's semi-violent and so forth. They were involved. It's part of the Iranian network of influence inside the United States, let alone their involvement with the drug trade and the southern border. I'm certain the Iranians have quite an extensive network of operatives that can cause terrible, terrible, terrible results in the United States. They're a direct threat. Even 9/11, by the way, I was always accused of trying to develop the intelligence to show that it was Iraq. The truth was, in the thing that I developed, which people cite, still classified, there was only one slide out of 130 some that mentioned Iraq. There were 20 slides that mentioned Iran. I'm not saying Iran was involved, but there was a lot more indications of Iranian involvement in 9/11 than there was Iraqi involvement. Iran has been out there all along, killing Americans. So the threat internally, I think, is huge. It's proven. It's been tried, and it's extreme. They're trying to kill our president. It's not a minor act.
Absolutely. David Wurmser, thank you very much for joining us today and giving us your insight into this historic moment that will have deep consequences, not just for the region and the safety of Israel, but also for the safety of the United States. And it will certainly be interesting to see how the next few days play out, and hopefully everybody stays safe.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, David.